from the American Academy of Pediatrics.
Most beverages marketed to children contain added sugar that can cause cavities, type 2 diabetes, and obesity.
The AAP and other leading health organizations have new recommendations for what children should be drinking.
A lot of our nutrition comes from beverages. The data from the obesity things, a lot of the added sugars come from the beverages. So this is a place where you can really make a change and a dent easily.
Plus, a new study examines the use of prescription stimulants by U.S. children between the years 2017 and 2023.
There are two major events that we thought could have potentially shifted stimulant prescribing to children during 2017 to 2023. The first was the COVID-19 pandemic, and the second was the nationwide shortage of immediate release Adderall, which was announced by the FDA in October 2022.
These stories and more on Pediatrics on Call, the podcast on children's health from the AAP. I'm Dr. David Hill.
And I'm Dr. Joanna Parga-Belinkie. This podcast is for everyone in the medical community, keeping our children healthy and safe.
It's a show by pediatricians for pediatricians.
But anyone who cares about kids will get a lot out of it as well. Let's start today's episode with a discussion about new beverage recommendations from the AAP.
Joanna, I'm curious, if I were sitting down to dinner with your family, what would I see your children drinking?
Well, as a pediatrician, I know that juice has too much sugar, so overwhelmingly we drink water. Sometimes there's chocolate milk, though.
Well, I grew up on iced tea, which might explain my childhood insomnia. But with our own children, we worked hard on making water the main beverage, at least if you don't count Capri Suns at soccer games.
But it is really hard because children and families face a barrage of marketing pushes with hundreds of different beverages. It can be hard to know what is good to drink and how much a drink can affect a child's growth and development.
Well, today we have a tall drink of water joining us from Memphis, Tennessee, my hometown. Dr. Mark Corkins is Division Chief of Pediatric Gastroenterology at Le Bonheur Children's Hospital, as well as Division Chief and Professor at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center. He also serves as the St. Jude Endowed Chair for Excellence in Pediatric Gastroenterology.
Dr. Corkins was a contributor to new healthy beverage recommendations from the Healthy Eating Research Group, which includes the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry, and the American Heart Association. Mark, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
So, Mark, this seems like such a big undertaking. Why were so many national organizations eager to work on this project?
Well, basically because this is where a large chunk of nutrition comes from in childhood. A lot of our nutrition comes from beverages. The data from the obesity things, a lot of the added sugars come from the beverages. So this is a place where you can really make a change and a dent easily, in theory, in the nutrition of children. And I was overjoyed in a way to be with all these smart people doing this process and having all these great organizations. More is better. We have our AAP statements, but the dentistry people have a little more about, even more about fluoride and even more about carbonation. And so there is literally all these organizations have their input, and it's literally more is better.
And the new guidelines divide beverages into ones to drink, ones to limit, and ones to avoid. Before we get into those categories, how did you make them, and what health benefits or risks did you focus on?
In the end, what we really, really want is it to be useful for families, right? And, we could come up with a 10-point scale and do, numbers and ranking and all that. But you really wanted to make it so that a family could look at it and say, these are the things we should drink the majority of the time. And then here's some, hey, it's okay every once in a while. And the ones that's hey, we should stay away from these. These are ones that, there's problems and, keep those at arm's length. And that was the whole idea, to make it useful. Because it doesn't matter if you invent a better mousetrap if, you don't have any mouse in your house.
Well, let's focus on drinks to drink. The big two in this report are water and milk. And Mark, I know when I talk to families about beverages, so many of them tell me their children just won't drink water. Are there ways that we can counsel families that can help them succeed in meeting these recommendations?
Well, we know that the number one influence on what kids eat and drink is their parents. If you want your kids to drink water, you have to drink water. You have to model drinking water. So that's number one. And number two, now still, if you're drinking lots of water and they still are kind of like turning up their nose at it, then there are some flavored waters out there. Not necessarily with added sugars, that would be a concern, but there's some with some little bit of flavoring in it, and that's okay if that's the way you get them started on drinking their water.
One concern with milk is that drinking too much can lead to anemia and constipation. Where is the sweet spot when it comes to milk consumption?
Well, so yes. So the big concern now, of course, is that kids don't drink enough, right? Because there's all sorts of things advertised and pushed, and it's just not cool to drink milk anymore. And too much can cause problems, but most kids don't get enough. But there are recommendations. Basically, a 5 to 8 year old needs 20 ounces a day, roughly, and a 9 to 18 year old needs 24 fluid ounces a day. And that should give them, the calcium and the phosphorus and the potassium and the magnesium and the different nutrients of concern that dairy has in it. I mean, dairy is a separate area in the My Plate. It used to be the food pyramid, now it's My Plate. Dairy used to be one of those categories because there are certain nutrients that it is better than supplying than any other category of foods. Now, people will say, wow, doesn't spinach give you calcium? Yes, spinach will give you calcium, but do you want to eat 5 bowls of spinach a day? That's a lot of spinach. Now, I can drink 3 or 4 glasses of milk, but I don't know if I can eat that much spinach. Even if I was Popeye, I don't know if kids know who Popeye is.
Strong to the finish. Because he eats spinach.
He eats spinach.
I think parents know. And what about all these non-dairy milks? Where do they fall? Are they also in the to-drink category?
No, they are not in the to-drink category. So the problem is these non-dairy beverages. There are some that are better than others, and there's a very much a breakdown on those. And you have to look at what they contain. There are a lot of them that are extremely low in protein and have added sugars. So the kids like it because they're sweeter, but they actually don't have much in the way of protein, especially. And so literally in the full report, we have a breakdown, and you have to look at the label. These beverages are presented as more healthy. They're advertised that way. And people get this impression that somehow they're healthier than milk. And they're not. They're actually not even close to the nutrient value of milk. And I don't know, maybe it's advertising. But it seems we've gotten this impression, or the general public has this impression, that they're better off drinking this. And actually, they're better off drinking milk.
Well, that is revealing. Could you speak specifically to soy and pea milk, which are listed as being slightly better for you than some of the other non-dairy alternatives? Let's start with pea milk.
Ripple milk. It's called Ripple milk.
Ripple milk.
Ripple. Ripple milk. And that's one of the best ones. The protein is very good, doesn't have much added sugar, and the calcium, phosphorus, and the potassium in it are great. That is one of the few. And then the soy is a very broad range. Soy has this huge range. There are some that are very good, and some that they have added sugars, and they aren't fortified, and they're terrible. The trouble is there's so many types of soy out there that literally you have to look at the label on them.
And while we have you, Mark, I want to milk you for another milk answer, which is that if I have flavored milks for my kids, like chocolate milk, is that bad? Is that something they need to avoid?
Well, again, I almost feel like a politician in this one, because that's one of the things we recommend limiting. The flavored milks tend to be a source of added sugars. And so, you don't want too much of the flavored milks. We prefer the plain milk. That said, the flavored milk seems to be something that helps keep the intake at a better level. Of course, they've released the new school dietary guidelines. And one of the things, the new guidelines, is they're asking the industry to reduce the amount of added sugar in the flavored milks. So they're working to get that down to a very low level so it's not like a huge sugar rush like it has been in the past.
Speaking of things we want to limit, a lot of people say that if sugar is the problem, why don't we just substitute a non-sugar sweetener and voila, the problem is solved. But how true is that, Mark?
It's not true at all. The general public isn't really aware, but the World Health Organization put out a huge body of work and published this review of the literature, and they looked at non-nutritive sweeteners. And what they found was it didn't produce weight loss. And in fact, the rate of heart disease and obesity almost seemed to go up on people who use non-nutritive sweeteners. Now, nobody knows why. It may not be even a direct metabolic effect, but there is something about activating the sweet in the taste buds and some downstream effects.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, part of what triggers our digestive system, speaking as a pediatric GI doctor, part of what triggers that is cerebral. We start to salivate when we smell fresh bread baking. That smell, and our mouth starts to water. And actually, our stomach starts to prepare. That's actually well documented. So, even if you drink something and it's got a non-nutritive sweetener in there, your body is preparing to digest and to process that. So that huge study showed that the non-nutritive sweeteners don't have any benefit. It didn't produce any health benefit. And then some of them, there's questions in the long term, we're going to find out there's some sort of health risk of high intake over years and years and years and years, and we don't have years and years and years of data. So if it doesn't produce any health benefit, then why take the risk?
Another drink we mentioned, David said he grew up on iced tea, which makes a lot of sense when I think about how energetic he is as an adult. But what is the right age for caffeine in drinks for kids?
There isn't one. Now, the AAP doesn't recommend any caffeine at all under 12, none. And then over 12, there's like, okay, it's probably okay up to this level, but caffeine is not a substitute for sleep, okay? It's a stimulant. Despite what David may say, we have no biological need for caffeine. There's not, a natural analog to caffeine. We don't biologically have to have it. And he's looking very sad. I know this is a podcast, but he looks very sad. And it's not a substitute for sleep. So kids will try to use like the energy drinks or the caffeine and the tea and the coffee to try to make up for cutting their sleep short. Yeah, it may give you, a burst of energy and all that, but it's not a substitute for sleep. You need to sleep. Your body repair. You're clearing your mind. All those things take place during sleep. And without restful sleep, you can take all the stimulants you want, and they're not going to replace sleep. And so I like to turn it around and say, okay, we recommend no caffeine because, again, we don't need caffeine, and we want our teenagers getting the adequate amount of sleep. We're talking about maybe school should start later for the older kids because they need sleep, but then we're turning around and they're drinking energy drinks to try to, wake up and perk up themselves. The thing we should be telling them is go to bed, get some sleep.
Well, Mark, are there any other drinks that we should be sure kids limit their intake of to maintain their overall health?
Well, sugar-sweetened beverages, So one of the most controversial probably is juice. Let's go there, okay? And, we would love for kids to drink no juice. Now, let me explain that to you. Ideally, we would eat fruits and vegetables. That is what the recommended daily intakes, that's what the dietary guidelines have, is fruits and vegetables. Now, the NHANES survey for like teenagers, the last one said the average teenager takes 0.8 fruits a day. I know it's math, right? It's epidemiology, right? So it's like 0.8. That's less than one. They don't even take one fruit a day. Now, juice can help supply some of the nutrients that come from a fruit. Now, it's not as good as a fruit because it has no fiber or some of those kind of nutrients in it, but it can help fill out that gap a little bit. Now, we're not talking about, sweetened juices. We're talking about 100% natural fruit juices can help fill that gap in. So we're like, okay, limited. This is that limited category, okay, in the middle. So it's like, okay, 1 glass of juice a day. Ideally, though, we'd have kids eating fruit. If they eat fruit, they don't have to drink juice. This is one of those things that's almost like, and it's accommodation just because of the realities of where our diets are.
Mark, now that you've given our listeners a taste of what's in these new recommendations, can you leave them with a to-go cup of takeaways?
All right. If your kids are thirsty, give them water. We like water. Water's a nutrient. Our body, you've always heard, we're like the earth. It's 70% water. And so that's where you start. That's the number one beverage our kids should start with when they're thirsty. There are some things that are, like juice. Again, ideally you'd be eating fruits, but here and there to help fill in that gap, it's okay. And then the last thing is things that are high in sugar. Literally, it's one of the top sources of added sugars in the diet. And if you really want to improve their health, get rid of those. And then caffeine's not a substitute for sleep. I think that's probably one of the big takeaways too there.
Well, I like all these takeaways, and Dr. Mark Corkins, thank you for sharing your cup of knowledge with us today.
Oh, my pleasure. I hope it runs over.
To see the new beverage recommendations from the Healthy Eating Research Group, go to aap.org/podcast.
Coming up, we'll look at trends in stimulant prescriptions for children. David, I know you have a good answer to this question. What's your favorite example of the old scientific phrase, correlation does not equal causation?
Well, living here at the beach, I have to say my favorite is that shark attacks rise in lockstep with ice cream sales. And of course, it's not because sharks like ice cream. I've never asked one personally, but because people go to the beach and buy ice cream at the same time when it's hot outside.
I'm an eating ice cream makes it hotter outside girl myself. And I mention this because a lot of the research we review on the podcast now has to do with big data sets, where it might be easy to bias yourself and look for answers to explain your logic from the data instead of letting the data speak for itself.
Oh, that is so true. And it reminds me of a recent study in pediatrics, prescription stimulant dispensing to U.S. children, 2017 to 2023. I think this will be a good one to review because Dr. Kao-Ping Chua can join us again, and he is great at pulling sense out of big data.
Dr. Chua joined us on episode 198 to talk about antidepressant prescribing, and he's back today to talk about stimulants. For those who didn't hear that episode, Dr. Chua is a primary care pediatrician and health services researcher in the Department of Pediatrics and the Susan B. Meister Child Health Evaluation and Research Center at the University of Michigan Medical School. Dr. Chua, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start by talking about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, because this is the main reason that people are using stimulants. How common is it, and how many people out there are using stimulant medication to treat it?
ADHD is one of the most common chronic conditions in children. It's estimated to affect approximately 10% of children during their lifetimes. Because one of the primary treatments for ADHD is stimulant therapy. Stimulants are one of the most commonly prescribed controlled substance to children, if not the most commonly prescribed.
And do you know how often they're prescribed for ADHD?
The first-line treatment for ADHD is often behavioral modifications. When that fails, stimulant therapy is often prescribed.
So why look at stimulant prescriptions up to 2023? What happened to ADHD diagnosis and treatment that made this important?
Well, there are two major events that we thought could have potentially shifted stimulant prescribing to children during 2017 to 2023. The first was the COVID-19 pandemic, and the second was the nationwide shortage of immediate release Adderall, which was announced by the FDA in October 2022.
So I think a lot of people are very familiar with the pandemic and all of the issues associated with supply chain and things during that. But then what prompted this later shortage of ADHD meds?
The shortage itself was a result of several different factors. First, one of the major manufacturers of Adderall started experiencing manufacturing delays in the middle of 2022. Second, the demand for stimulants started to surge in adults, though not in children, as evidenced in our study. This may have been related to the fact that the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration allowed stimulants to be initiated via telehealth during the pandemic without an in-person evaluation.
And talk to me about which stimulant specifically you chose to study in this case.
Our main focus was immediate release Adderall, which is one of the most commonly prescribed stimulants to children.
And we were talking about big data earlier. What data set helped you look at stimulant prescriptions, and what were you asking of it?
We were using the IQVIA longitudinal prescription database. This is a all-payer national prescription database that captures 92% of prescriptions dispensed in U.S. retail pharmacies, as well as the vast majority of prescriptions dispensed in mail order and long-term care pharmacies. Our question was really, first of all, after March 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic began, how much did stimulant dispensing to children change? And second, after the FDA announced the nationwide shortage of Adderall in October 2022, how did that affect stimulant dispensing patterns to children?
Okay, so we have these two big events, one in which school attendance is severely disrupted, and another in which the ability of people to get a hold of their usual prescriptions are disrupted. What did you see related to these two events?
Let's start with the COVID-19 pandemic. We find that the monthly stimulant dispensing rate to U.S. children aged 5 to 17 years dropped very sharply after March 2020. It began to recover afterwards, but it did so in a highly heterogeneous manner. So, for example, among male adolescents, the decline in stimulant dispensing never recovered to the pre-pandemic baseline, unlike for younger children as well as for female adolescents.
And what about other age groups? Did you have any significant findings in those?
So the stimulant dispensing rates to male and female young children as well as female adolescents declined, but then recovered or even exceeded the pre-pandemic baseline by the end of the study period in 2023. This was simply not the case for male adolescents. For that group, stimulant dispensing declined and remained low. This actually parallels the previous study that I published on antidepressant dispensing to adolescents during the pandemic, in which we also saw that the antidepressant dispensing rate to male adolescents declined and never recovered, unlike in females.
So that means fewer male children have ADHD? You see right there, my mind is falling into the correlation causation trap. I mean, what do you think really explains these findings, and how can we study them further?
I don't think that there's any evidence that the mental health of male adolescents actually improved during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the only way that you would see a decline in both antidepressant dispensing and stimulant dispensing is if fewer male adolescents were being diagnosed with mental health conditions and being treated for it. This raises a lot of concerns about underdiagnosis and undertreatment of mental health conditions among male adolescents. Now, why that's actually happening is not clear. One hypothesis is that the transition to virtual schooling played a role, because oftentimes mental health conditions are detected among male adolescents by school staff who witness things like academic difficulties or behavioral issues, which prompt parents to bring their child to the pediatrician. Without the kind of the in-person school staff serving as that kind of monitoring role, it's possible that a lot of these conditions just went undetected and undiagnosed.
So we looked at what happened with the pandemic, but then the other part of this paper addressed what happened when there was a shortage of medication. And what did you find there?
So surprisingly, we found that the Adderall shortage, or at least the announcement of the Adderall shortage in October 2022, was not associated with a change in the stimulant dispensing rate to children overall. But what we did find is that it was associated with the types of stimulants that were dispensed. So for example, we did see that in October 2022, dispensing of immediate release Adderall decreased, which is exactly what you would expect. But there was an increase in dispensing of other stimulants such as Focalin. And what that suggests is that the shortage did not necessarily cause children to stop a stimulant therapy altogether, but it may have forced some of them to switch from Adderall to other stimulants. And that would be potentially concerning if those switches lead to worsening control of ADHD symptoms or increases in medication errors.
And do you have any last takeaways for pediatricians who are going to read this article?
I think pediatricians should be aware that there's a possibility that mental health conditions and concerns are not being detected as much in male adolescents, and they should perhaps dig a little bit more deeply when they do have the opportunities to see male teenagers in their practice. I think the other thing that I would emphasize regarding the shortage is that there probably are a lot of children who did end up needing to be switched from Adderall to other medications, to other stimulants. And that, given how recent our data are, it's quite possible that those children are still on those new medications. So I think it would be really important just to make sure that those new medications that children were switched to are working just as well to control ADHD symptoms as the previous regimen.
Well, Dr. Kao-Ping Chua, I want to thank you so much for joining us again today.
Thank you for having me.
To read the paper, Prescription Stimulant Dispensing to U.S. Children, 2017 to 2023, go to our website at aap.org/podcast.
At the end of every episode, we like to leave you with something positive or enlightening. We call this segment Say Ah. David, what's your Say Ah this week?
Well, we got a surprise visit from our youngest, Julian, who was away at college and just not enjoying himself and just feeling antsy. And he just really wanted to come home and get hugs and be taken care of. So we did that. And he hung out and helped me make dinner for him. And we had a great conversation over our meal. And then we put him back on a plane and sent him back to school.
My Say Ah, I'll also make about my son. He's my middle, not my youngest. And he's been taking dance classes because he's very into kind of singing and dance. And I haven't seen the final performance yet because it'll be later in the spring, but he is so into it. And having taken him and seeing him do it the other day, it was just like really incredible to watch how into it he is. So it's fun to find activities that your kids really enjoy.
That is delightful. Yeah, we've had 2 sons and a couple of daughters go through dance classes, so enjoy that recital. They are absolutely precious. That's it for today's episode. If you like Pediatrics on Call, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and help us spread the word. Follow us on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram at Pediatrics on Call.
Pediatrics on Call is a production of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Our producers and editors are Ann Johnsos and Claire Keating. Our audio engineer is Doug Nagel. Joe Puskars is our associate producer, and Susan Martin is our executive producer. Our theme music was composed by Matthew Simonson. Join us next week when we'll discuss detecting biliary atresia in infants.
We'll talk to the authors of a new clinical report, Dr. Sanjeev Harpavat and Saul Karpin. I'm Dr. David Helm.
And I'm Dr. Joanna Parga-Belinkie. Thanks for listening.